pieces. Push it, 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 push it. Go get the money, go get the money.
Hey you. Yeah, you. Can I get a slice of that pizza? Alright, bet. What if I told you some true facts about energy flow? Okay, how about you tell me where food comes from? Yeah, that's right. From animals and plants. Do you know why we eat food? Alright, bet. We eat food because we need energy. Energy is needed by living organisms for growth,
I got the moves.
motor movement,
I got the moves.
and reproduction. Lastly, energy is needed for repair. As we grow old, our cells get damaged and new cells are produced.
Let's dive into where this energy comes from. All this energy does not magically come from the producers, but rather the sun. Plants are the only species that make their own food. Others, called consumers, derive their energy from either autotrophs or producers that make their own organic molecules, usually through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a very important process. The plants use the solar energy, water, and carbon dioxide to produce glucose and oxygen. In terms of an actual formula, 6CO2 plus 6H2O equals C6H12O6 plus 6O2. The glucose gives energy to the primary consumers, allowing energy to be transferred to them, and the oxygen allows them to breathe.
Oh look, there's a giraffe. Herbivores are animals that only eat plants, making them a primary consumer. They are also known as heterotrophs. Oh no, what is happening? It's a lion.
I am the one, the way your son don't need a gun to get respect up on the street.
Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, such as this lion, transferring energy to them. They are also called carnivores because they eat other animals.
Energy flow is best understood through food chains, which is the linear passage of energy from one organism to another. Basically, consumers are dependent on plants. In these food chains, there are producers, or autotrophs, that make their own organic molecules, usually through photosynthesis. The producers get eaten by consumers, or heterotrophs. There are different levels of consumers, starting from primary consumers, for an animal like a giraffe, who is a vegetarian and eats mainly leaves from a tree. Then secondary consumers eat primary consumers, such as this lion, transferring energy. You also have different classifications other than the consumers and producers. These include decomposers, which convert organic material into small elements and molecules like fungi and bacteria. These nutrients are then used by plants to create food.
There are also detrivores, which specializes in breaking down dead tissues and waste products into smaller products. Lastly, there are scavengers, which simply consume dead animals. An example of a scavenger would be a vulture.
Let's take a look at a different food chain. Here, the rat eats the acorn, which comes from the tree, acting as a primary consumer. The snake then eats the rat, acting as the secondary consumer. Lastly, the eagle eats the snake, acting as the tertiary consumer. The eagle then decomposes into nutrients for the plants to produce fruit.
Food chains with one producer, one primary consumer, and one secondary consumer, like the one we saw, are called simple food chains. Unfortunately, life is not that simple. This next picture is a more realistic depiction of how an actual food web looks.
The energy transfers from each level, with 10% being transferred from one level to the other, with a 90% loss at each stage. This is why there are more producers and more primary consumers than there are animals way up the chain like tertiary consumers. The population of the tertiary consumers can only be 10% of the secondary consumers, just like how the population of the secondary consumers can only be 10% of the primary consumers. Look at this energy pyramid. The transfer of this energy from each consumer to another is described by their trophic levels, which is really just another way to say primary, secondary, or tertiary consumers. So in summary, for every 1,000 producers, there's 100 primary consumers, 10 secondary consumers, and 1 tertiary consumer.
A lot of animals that people desire to eat tend to be high up the food chain, which can be a real problem for the environment as a whole, like swordfish. When people attempt to breed these animals in an aquaculture setting, it is very demanding because they must get other fish that are already high up the food chain for the swordfish to eat. It would be a lot better if people simply ate at lower level consumers, like sardines.
The process of one species eating another and another up the food chain is somewhat problematic due to a thing called bioaccumulation. When a pollutant enters the food chain, that's called biomagnification. When this pollutant is eaten by a consumer and that consumer is eaten by a higher consumer, bioaccumulation occurs. This makes tertiary and higher consumers somewhat dangerous to eat at times. This is seen in the fish populations often with the accumulation of mercury. Low-level consumers, like sardines, may consume a small but acceptable level of mercury. As that pollutant accumulates up the food chain, a higher consumer, like salmon, may have a lot of mercury and become too dangerous to eat.
So now that you learned so much about energy flow, can I get some of that pizza? Dude, come on! Alright, I'm just gonna take it. Head ass.
Sit down, be humble. Sit down, be humble. Sit down, be humble. Sit down,